In this phase, we're going to add an instance variable to our player. In every game, there seems to be a time in which you don't want the person playing it to be able to control the player or move them around. So by using this instance variable, we're going to be able to activate and deactivate the player when we need to. Make sure a USB flash drive is connected and that you have your project guide out. We're going to create an instance variable called active to track our player. Then we're going to use that to create events that at particular moments either activate or deactivate the ability to control the player, to move it, and so forth. So let's get started. We're going to start by adding an instance variable to the player. In your project bar, find the player object type and right-click instance variables. Then you can use the plus to add as many instance variables as you like. We're going to create one called active, all lowercase, and it's going to use a data type of Boolean. Boolean is a fancy value for what we call binary values, things that can either be on, off, true, false, yes, no. By default, we want our active variable to be false, and we need to give a meaningful description, whether the player is active. What I mean by that is this instance variable is going to track whether the person playing your game can control the character. When this instance variable is false, that means that the person playing your game is not going to be able to move the player. But when it's true, they will be able to use their keyboard and other input methods to control the player. Remember, instance variables are different than global variables. Instance variables are exactly what they sound like. They're values that you can associate with each individual object instance. So, for example, let's say that I had an instance variable on my B object type. I would then be able to track that value for each individual B. The next thing we need to do, at the very beginning of every level, of every layout, we need to be able to activate the player. We put that kind of code in our start and end level event sheet. We have two different event groups. We have the start of level, end of level. So this is another action that needs to go in the start of level. So let's add action. Choose your player, and under instance variables, you'll see there's one called set Boolean. We have a Boolean instance variable called active, and we want to set it to true. So whenever we start a level, we are going to activate our player by setting its active instance variable to true. Likewise, we want to deactivate the player at the end of the game. When the player succeeds, we need to be able to deactivate it right away. So let's add an action under this end of level event group in the event block that has to do with colliding with the exit sign when all the coins have been collected. Once again, add action, player. Under instance variable, set Boolean. And since we're deactivating the player, active is false. And then drag this action to be the first in the event block. So at the beginning of every level, every layout, we activate the player. And then if the player succeeds, we deactivate the player so that the user can't control it anymore. Remember, if for some reason the player collides with an enemy, we destroy the player so we don't have to deactivate it. What's going to make all this magic work? Just setting the player's instance variable to true and false isn't going to provide the meaningful functionality we need in the game. What we need to do is go to the player event sheet. In this sheet, we have all of the code that affects the player movement. If the user that's playing your game uses the keyboard, it will move the alien. But if we only allow that to happen when its active instance variable is true, then we've added the functionality that we need to the game. So what we're going to do is we're going to add an event. And we're going to say our condition is player. And under instance variables, choose is Boolean instance variable set. So when active would be our condition. So we're going to create a new event. This event has one condition. if the player is active. Now, normally we would add actions, but we're going to do something a little bit different here. I want you to take this event block, I want you to drag it right underneath the every tick event. And then we're going to select, using the shift key, all of the different events that should only happen if the player is active, if its active instance variable is set to true. This is what we call sub-events. If the player is active, if this condition is met, then it will execute or consider any of the events underneath it, any of the sub-events. What's great about construct 2 is it reads like English. If the player is active, if the person playing the game is allowed to control the player, then look for keyboard triggers. Look for whether the left arrow is down. Consider whether the platform behavior is jumping and do things. But if the player is not active, if the active instance variable is false, then none of the events underneath this will be considered. They won't fire, they won't execute, they won't run whatsoever. This is what we call a sub-event. So by doing just this one small thing, by adding an instance variable to the player and then rearranging our code so only certain things happen if the value is true, we've provided the functionality, we've created the functionality that allows us to disable and enable the player. Let's go ahead and save the project. Make sure that your events look like this. Refer to your step-by-step project guide.